Which one of you is Holmes?
The name's Sherlock Holmes, and the address is 221B Baker Street.
I've been studying her comings and goings. They appear most sinister.
Every problem is absurdly simple when it is explained to you.
Coffee table on the left-hand side, coffee mug handle pointing to the left. Power sockets, habitually use the ones on the left.
Most engaging.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Kate, as human beings, we're obsessed with shows like CSI and Criminal Minds, but really all of this stuff happened way before television shows, even way before this discovery we had with DNA. How did you come across this particular story?
Well, my first book was about a really, really big event told through the lens of a lot of different people. It was about a deadly smog and a killer caught in it. And for the second book, I wanted to do the reverse. I wanted several events told through the lens of one person. And I always wanted to do something on a forensic scientist. So I just bought this book that's essentially the Encyclopedia of Criminals in the United States from the Mayflower. There was a killer on the Mayflower. All the way until the 1970s is when this book was published, which was perfect for me because I don't have an interest in anything more contemporary than that. And like on page 100, I ran across this incredible story that's in the book about a train robbery that actually was not a robbery because the robbers were so inept that they blew apart the part of the train that had all the money in it and didn't get away with anything. And the person who solved the case was nicknamed America's Sherlock Holmes. And that's how I learned about Edward Oscar Heinrich.
As a journalist, which you are, also a professor of journalism, you kind of peeled the onion, as we say, and you got to this man that you talk about. And you say he was a productive hoarder, and that's what works in terms of research.
When I walked into his archive, he had, for anybody who's ever done research, he had more than 100 boxes at UC Berkeley, which were just filled to the brim with everything. So he kept things that he should have never kept that clearly should have been with the police departments. He had like bomb parts and locks of hair from murder victims. He had a locket from a woman who was run over 6 times by her own limousine. I mean, he just had all of this crazy stuff. It was amazing for me to see. So thank goodness I am, as somebody who writes, I love productive hoarders.
Yeah, because now you're not going by just stories, you're actually seeing who this person was. He kind of comes to life through his things. Okay, Edward Oscar Heinrich, let's go back to his childhood and get a better understanding of who this man was.
So he grew up in poverty in the late 1800s, and he was in Wisconsin with his family first. And then his father, who was a carpenter, was sort of chronically underemployed and decided to move the whole family to Tacoma because the railroad had just been built there and he thought that they would have work. But his father constantly suffered from just not being able to have enough money. And so they were really poverty stricken. He spent a lot of time in his letters talking about how the only vision of Santa Claus he ever had was from the Salvation Army Santa Claus who would come and visit. His father dies by suicide really tragically, and he finds his body. And it just, I've never seen the reverberations of one action go through an entire family like this. It changed the trajectory of his career, of his life, how he related to people, things he obsessed over. And in a really strange, sad way, it made him an incredibly effective forensic scientist.
He was obsessed with the why, it sounds like, right? And so some of the other cases, you mentioned that the train robbery, another case was Bessie Ferguson.
That's my favorite case. It's very tragic, but I don't want to give it away because I'm notorious, Deborah, for giving away. He was sent a pretty gruesome thing in a mail. It was a ear with part of a scalp attached. And the people who found it, the police didn't even know if it belonged to a male or female. They just assumed the person was dead, which, no kidding, that person's definitely not alive anymore. And they said, we need the rest of the body. We can't figure out where she is, or he. And so Oscar examined the ear and found a piece of sand, a grain of sand, several of them actually, that didn't belong where her ear was found. It didn't belong there. And so through a whole lot of razzle-dazzle forensic science tests that only he really knew how to run, he was able to point to where the rest of the body was 12 miles away from where the ear was found. And her body parts were buried everywhere. So it probably would have been an impossible thing to ever find her. And so that case was really interesting for me because she was sort of a controversial murder victim, and which was very odd to see the way that this man who believed that women should still wear corsets, and he really disliked the flappers of the 20s, really felt so much empathy for this woman and sort of the way that she had her life set up and how she ended up probably what led to her being killed. So it's a really interesting story. And each one of these cases, when you write a book or you do a story on someone who's a professional like this, each case tells you, it's another piece of the puzzle that tells you, more about the person.
Because what he did was gathered all those puzzle pieces that put together a bigger picture that we still use today. Bloodstain pattern analysis, not fun to talk about, but it is used. Fingerprint evidence, lie detectors, and ballistics. These are things that we still think that kind of happened in recent years, but he was doing it back then.
Part of the book also, I've never enjoyed the white knight. I think everybody has complications and everyone has problems and they seep into your work. And Oscar's problem was, I think, overconfidence in a lot of his abilities, because, at the beginning of any discipline, you're going to make so many mistakes. And this was the beginning of forensics. When he worked from 1910 until 1953, the beginning of forensics in America, really in the world, is when it was sort of, being honed. He believed everything that he concluded, and he refused to believe otherwise. And that's a problem. That's a problem today. It's a problem because some of the techniques that he used and that people still use today are not reliable. We know that fingerprint analysis should not be the only evidence used.
Well, as you mentioned, pieces of a puzzle to build a case. And of course, today we have this thing called DNA that enters the picture as well. And even then, there are times when people, are not guilty of the crime, even though DNA showed up at the crime scene. Kate, this is really so interesting. Like I said, we're a lot of us are really obsessed with it. You were an intern at KVUE 24 in Austin when I was there, and I always thought you were a little different, Kate. You're okay?
I am. Well, I didn't have the dark thoughts. I know I interviewed somebody the other day and they said, boy, you have such a dark world. And this was a psychiatrist who goes into prisons to interview prisoners. And I said, my dark world, you have a dark world.
All right, let's go into the light. Let me just say, hook 'em horns.
Yes, hook 'em.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. It's interesting, because I think there's other lessons that you learn from this too, is deductive reasoning, is not judging too quickly. There are all kinds of sidebar kind of lessons that we learn from this as well.
Absolutely.